All right, welcome back, everybody. Today we're going to be going through and talking about SQB2, which is introducing the quadratic formula. Now, it says for a quadratic equation that's formatted in this manner, this is always how we like to see these formatted, the quadratic formula is written as this. Now, what the quadratic formula does for us is it tells us the number of it tells us what our answers are. This is how we find answers. So how we find answers to a quadratic equation. And a quadratic equation is, of course, something that looks like this. Now, the nice thing about the quadratic formula is that it works on absolutely any problem you throw at it. Now, let's go through this process together here. So here's how you're going to start. First thing you're going to do in any one of these problems is you're always going to identify what is A, what is B, and what is C. Now remember, A is always the number that sits in front of x squared, B is the number that sits in front of x, and C is the constant, or the one that doesn't have an x. Now once you know what those are, then step 2 should really be writing out those in the quadratic formula. So the quadratic formula is negative b plus or minus. We'll talk about this because this is very possible that that's a new idea to you. Plus or minus, we say plus or minus, the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Now that's going to be something you're ultimately going to need to memorize, and it's really important in math, so start trying to practice that as we go. So coming over here, so again, let's just write it out. B squared minus 4 times hold on. Negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Now, if you remember yesterday, we started by talking about the discriminant. And remember, the discriminant was b squared minus 4ac. And notice how that shows up in our problem here. So we're going to kind of use what we know about the discriminant to help us solve these problems. And actually, if you look at it, the formula, whatever's left here, once you get rid of that discriminant part, the rest of what's left is pretty basic, right? So we kind of took the hardest part of this yesterday without even knowing it. So again, negative b. So our b value in this is a positive 9, so now we're going to put negative 9. And then we're going to say plus or minus, and we'll come back to that symbol and how we use that. And then now we have the square root of our discriminant. So that is b squared. So just like yesterday, we're going to want to use parentheses. So 9 squared minus 4 times a is negative 6, times c, which is 8. And then all of this gets divided by 2 times negative 6. Now, I like to believe that step 1 is just labeling down A, B, and C. And that step 2 really is actually writing out the formula super accurately so that we can actually start to evaluate it. And that's what we're going to do in step 3. Now, before we get too far, in step 3, I like to tackle just the discriminant. So, step 3, let's just evaluate whatever is inside there. So, coming over here, if I had 9 squared minus 4 times negative 6 times 8, right? That's my discriminant that we learned about yesterday. Then we did this on our calculator. So parentheses 9 to the second power minus 4 times negative 6 times 8. And we find out that this is 273. Now, officially, this is the number that is under the square root over here. So now we're going to rewrite all of this formula again. So here we go. We're going to have negative 9 plus or minus the square root. Now we know what the number inside of the square root is. That's 273 because we just found that right up here. Now coming across on the bottom, we're going to have 2 times negative 6 still. So let's go through and do a little bit more evaluating. The two pieces you're going to still be able to evaluate is you're going to be able to multiply this out, and you're going to be able to take the square root of 273. So, to do that, I'm going to have negative 9. That part's not going to change. The plus or minus isn't going to change. And now we'll get to the square root of 273. So on our calculator, we can punch that in, and we find out that that's equal to 16.52. So we're just going to keep that as a decimal, 16.52. And then, of course, on the bottom, we have 2 times negative 6, which is negative 12. Now, coming over here, this is actually really basic and hopefully straightforward and easy to solve at this point. I know it definitely wasn't when we started. But now to finish the problem up, we're going to set up 2 answers. So we come over here to our calculator again. And here's what we're going to do. We're going to take negative 9. So first we're just going to punch in kind of the whole top. But here's where we have a little bit of a choice to make. So if you notice, we have this symbol. And that's we call it a plus or minus. So here's what we want to do. We want to first do the first one. We're going to do 2 situations or 2 circumstances with a plus. And then we'll do the second one with a minus. So negative 9 plus 16.52. So let's get that number. And then since it's all being divided by 12 or negative 12, now let's divide that by negative 12. And that's going to give us our first answer. So our first answer will be x equals negative 0.63. Let's round up to the nearest hundredth. Now, that was when we used the plus symbol. Now let's use the minus symbol. So we're going to do negative 9. Now, instead of using the plus, we're going to use the minus on this one. So minus 16.52. I think I used... We get that as our number. And then we're going to take that and divide it by negative 12. And we get 2.12. So x is equal to 2.1. Oh, I should round that, 2.13 for our final answer. Right, so that's how we get our 2 answers out of this, and we knew it should have had 2 answers because our discriminant over here was positive. Let's do another one of those because I absolutely believe these are hard and kind of difficult to follow until you do enough where you start to get the process. So here's our next one. First thing we want to do, identify A, B. Well, hold on a second. This is not even written correctly, so let's write it correctly. Remember, in order for us to identify A, B, and C, it has to be equal to 0 first. So we got to make it equal to 0. So let's subtract the x over and subtract the 6 over to the other side. That will make this and this cancel out, so we're going to be equal to 0 on that side. Now, 5x squared will be sitting in front. Then we'll have minus x and minus 2. 4 take away 6 would give us negative 2. Now remember, if we don't see a number in front of any of these, we can put a 1 in there to hold that spot. So looks like A is equal to 5, B is equal to negative 1, and C is equal to negative 2. Now once we've made it that far, let's carry on here a little bit. So coming over, our next part in this process, just like we did before, is let's write out our quadratic formula and then let's fill in our values. So our quadratic formula, negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Now once we've made it this far, we got to plug in our values. So b is negative 1. So we're going to have a negative 1 plus or minus the square root of negative 1 squared, because that was your b value, minus 4. Our a value is 5, so negative 4 times 5, times our c value, which is negative 2. And this is all over 2 times 5, because a was 5. Now, once we've made it this far, there's some really easy cleanup stuff I can do right now. So maybe I want to do that. So I'm going to clean this up. Remember, if I have 2 negatives, they always make a positive. So this is just like positive 1. The other thing I can clean up really easily is 2 times 5. That's 10. So I'm going to put that on the bottom, and I'm cleaning that up. Now, the next part, whatever's inside the square root, is always hardest to clean up. So we normally do that in a second or a separate step. So I'm just going to recopy it. Okay, so just like we did before, so that was kind of like step 2. Now we're doing step 3. Step 3 is when we pull out just the discriminant just this stuff, and we sit there and evaluate that. So, -1 squared minus 4 times 5 times -2. We're just going to worry about the inside. And like I've always said, it's best to just do this part on your calculator. -1 squared minus 4 times 5 times -2. And when you hit enter, notice how we get 41. Now 41 is the number that is inside of our square root. So now when we come over here and we can rewrite it, we can jump from here to our next step. So this, I'm just going to recopy 1 plus or minus the square root. Now we just went and figured out what was inside of the square root, and we found out that that was 41. So we want to put 41 right here. And this is all over 10. So 1 plus or minus the square root of 41 all over 10. So let's evaluate this now. So the square root of 41, that's a calculator operation. So second square root 41, we get 6.4. Since it's a 0, we don't need to write it, and it didn't get rounded up. So we're just going to call it 6.4. Nice. So now at this point, remember, this is where we go and get our two answers. So in order to do this, we have to evaluate the plus minus sign. So we're going to do 1 plus 6.4, get that number, and divide that number by the bottom. So we get 0.74. So x equals 0.74. That's our first answer. And our second answer is going to come when we do subtraction. So 1 minus 6.4. We get that answer and divide that by 10. And we get negative 0.54. Which will be our second answer, right? And that's what we're looking for. We're just trying to get those two answers to our problem. Now, sometimes we're going to find out there's two answers. Sometimes we're actually going to find out there's no answers. And I'll try to get to a spot where we'll see that. So here's a third problem for us to consider. So in this problem, what's going to happen is, well, first off, everything's all over the place. It's not equal to 0, so we're going to do some work. So let's pull this over to the other side. Notice how I'm just using opposite signs so that these cancel and give us 0. So I'm going to subtract 5x over here and add 2 to keep it balanced. So I'm going to have my 2x squared minus 5x plus 2. In this situation, we can see a is equal to 2, b is equal to negative 5, and c is equal to 2. Nice job. Now let's write out our quadratic formula. So negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c all over 2a. So our first step should be to plug in everything to start. So negative 5. So I'm going to have, so first off, notice how we have a negative b. So I'm going to have a negative, and then here's my b value. So negative 5 plus or minus the square root of negative 5 squared minus 4 times a times c. Okay, so now let's keep cruising. This is all over 2a. So 2 times 2. So let's just do the easy simplifyings first. So negative 5 makes that into a positive 5. Plus or minus, then we have that square root. We're going to figure out the square root in a minute. And then on the bottom, 2 times 2 is just 4. So let's figure out what number belongs in the square root. So we're going to pull out whatever was inside the square root, which was that negative 5 squared minus 4 times 2 times 2. So our negative 5 squared minus 4 times 2 times 2. And we just want to evaluate that. So this is where our calculator is our best friend. Negative 5 to the second power minus 4 times 2 times 2. And we get 9. Nice. 9 is finally a nice number there. So 9 is really the number that goes in the square root. So we're just going to rewrite it now. So I'm going to undo that blank, and I'm going to put my 9 in there. So now we look at it. Well, we can figure out the square root of 9. That's what we got to do next before we evaluate. So we're going to have 5 plus or minus. Now hopefully you recognize that the square root of 9 is just 3. So we're going to get a 3 there. And now this is where we're going to get our two answers. So we're going to do 5 plus 3 divided by 4. So 5 plus 3 divided by 4. 5 plus 3 will give us 8. And 8 divided by 4 will give us 2. So x equals 2 will be one of our answers. Our other one is when we do the minus. So 5 minus 3 is going to give us 2. 2 divided by 4 gives us 0.5. So x is equal to 0.5, or you could have said 1/2, because I know you know 0.5 is also 1/2. And that's really it. That is how we go through and we do the quadratic formula. Now, there's nothing really easy about this, but a couple of things to remember. So remember, a lot of this hinges on the discriminant. And the discriminant was the part we were always kind of finding right up in this area. Discriminant, discriminant, discriminant. In most of these problems, I think you're going to always end up with the discriminant being a positive number. And that's why we're getting our two answers, because when the discriminant is positive, like we learned yesterday, that's when two answers occur. Now, if the discriminant is equal to 0, I just want you to think about this. So if our discriminant, right, the part that would have went inside of this would have been equal to 0, we would have gotten 5 plus or minus the square root of 0 over 4. Now just think about this for a second. What is the square root of 0? Well, it's 0. So 5 plus or minus 0 over 4. Well, 5 plus 0 is just 5. Divided by 4 will be 5/4. 5 minus 0 is still going to be 5. Divided by 4 will be 5/4. Notice how we get the same answer here. Since both of these are exactly the same, that's why we only get the one answer when our discriminant's equal to 0, because adding and subtracting 0 are the same number. That's why we only get the one answer. But we say that it happens twice. Now, here's the last part. If your discriminant ever ends up being negative, and I don't think it does in these problems, but I just want to tell you in case. If your discriminant ends up being negative, so let's pretend we would have gotten a negative 9. We would have had 5 plus or minus the square root of a negative over 4. Now, when I try to punch in, remember, you can't take the square root of a negative. So second square root negative 9, your calculator will even yell at you. So when this happens, we just say no solution. There is no solution or 0 solutions that will make this happen. So if that discriminant ever ends up being negative, you stop the problem right there and you don't need to go any further, because there's no way you can evaluate it. Now, I know this is hard. I know it's going to take some practice. Please dig into it today. If you have questions, though, make sure you're reaching out. I'm here to help. Thanks, guys. Have a good day.